The bone fields. Longships. Thurl braced against the cold wind and gripped her oar tight as the storm buffeted the longship Barulfer. Beneath them, all around them, the ocean was a broiling black cauldron, heaving its might against their own. It had not yet found them wanting. Inge hunched up beside her and grinned madly as the sea crashed over the side of the longboat. Her shaven head was lathered with sweat and rain, and the tattoos that covered her skin shone as they fleshly inked. Njord is in one of his moods again, she called over the wind. Thorol spat out water and wiped her lips. He was always angry this time of year. Halvor was foolish to make us stay for so long. She stared along the aisles, past the ragged band of figures that made up the rest of the company. Halvor stood at Verulfur's helm, unbowed by the frantic gale that hammered the ship. His long hair was soaked through, matted against his head and neck. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, in search of the sister ship, Veldtulfer, who had disappeared into the storm. Halvor's rays are always the most rewarding, said Inge. That's why he chose to stay, and that's why we chose to come. This old god's anger is small price for what we have taken. Thurl nodded. It had been a bountiful raid, and Halvor's company had made enough for them all to secure land and power upon their return home. They had struck the coast at first, like any other raiding party, and taken what they could from the farms they had found there. But Halvor was ambitious, and they soon found themselves sneaking into larger settlements and then sacking them. It had been slaughter, one well worth the wait. She glanced over her shoulder towards the covered stern of the boat. She'd even managed to secure a slave on this expedition, her first. He sat huddled up beside two others, shivering through his soaking rags. Frithjof better not have gotten himself lost, Ing squinted in her eyes against the rain. Or sailed Veldfur to the ocean floor, then we'll never see half our spoils. Afterlife or no. I'll hunt him down and wring his thin neck until his eyes pop out. Inge had another reason for wanting to see Veldulfer again. Her lover, Akis, sailed with Frithjof. The warrior had spurned their advances at first, but Ing was not easily dissuaded. The first night on Bretland's soil had seen them share a bedroll, and they'd spent every night together since. Not even Frithjof would dare sink his ship when he carries Halvor's cargo. You'll see, storm relents. You'll see that stupid boy's face again. Ing slapped her on the back and grinned. I'm more interested in what's between his legs. Thurl rolled her eyes and sank her oar into the water. The pull of the waves was getting stronger, and she struggled to find a rhythm. Others in the company, Hurlead and Oval, but others too, had already given up. They sat wrapped in great furs beside sheltered braziers, taking what little warmth they could. Halvor will tell us to stow away the oars soon, said Ing, her smile fading. Then we'll need to hold fast until the storm passes, or join Frithjof at the bottom of the sea. Thurl shrugged. Halvor was too shrewd a sailor to let mere storm defeat him. But when one's time came, even the trickster himself would be hard put to evade his fate. She turned to the sea and watched as it rampaged and turned beneath gray clouds. For too long she had been away from the open waters, and her mood had dampened with each day it had moved inland. Now that she was back, cold as she was, wet as she was, she felt her spirits soar. Her eyes narrowed as a wave rose up beside Varulfer. It drew a ship toward it until they were tilted horizontally against it, and a gauzy mist of water splashed over them. Halvor rode the wave expertly, bringing the longship over it before it could crest and plummet them all to their doom. As the waves diminished beneath them, Thurl she saw a flash of silver below the surface, scales of an enormous shape riding along them. But when she blinked again, it was gone. Land! She shook free the vision and looked up as the call rang out again. What land is here? Ing rose from her seat beside her. stepping up onto in an effort to see over the heads of the rest of the company. There is nothing, Ulfgar said from the seat opposite them. He ran a hand over his stubby head and shrugged. Not for many days still. There must be a mistake. There is. Something. Ing leaned on Thorol's shoulders for support and rose on her toes for a better look. I see a thin line, barely a smudge, but it has a look of land about it. To your oars! Halvor's voice boomed above the storm. He strode between the aisle, pulling the crew back down to their seats. We make for the shore, and a break from the storm. Ing plopped back down beside her and laid her hand on the oar. Together, they pulled deep against the chopping waters for the smudge on the horizon. The howling wind relented as they navigated their way to a sheltered cove, where the ocean was strangely dead and still. The land around them was unfamiliar, and Thorol felt herself tense as she started up at the great crags above. Where had they come from? She had never seen this place before, and the maps did not speak of it, unless the storms had blown them further off course than she realized. Halvor had them moored Valrulfur along the coast, and then set a team to repair what little damage the storm had done. Thorol took up her sword and shield and walked along the beach with Ing while the rest set up camp. She could see Halvor's pathfinders moving up ahead of them, slipping in and out of the trees that hemmed in the shoreline. Maybe they'll find us another farmstead. Ing thumped her sword against her shield and smiled. Or perhaps the little lord and his castle, too far from anyone to call for help. That would be enough to settle my debt with Dag. No. Thorol stayed quiet. Her own debts had been covered weeks ago, and she did not have it in mind to raid again. Ing stared at her from out of the corner of her eye and then bumped into her with a shield. You were never smiling, even when things were good. Troubled Thorol. That's what they should call you in the songs. Only because that hole in your face never closes, she replied, returning the shove. Ing laughed loud and skipped about her, kicking up chunks of sand. Troubled Thorol. Aesir's daughter did not smile. Troubled Thorol. Cold as Jotun, with rage like Freya. Thorol dropped her sword and shield, and covered her ears. You sing like a dog, Ing. If the gods could hear you now, they'd cut out your tongue. Good enough for the beer halls, but not for troubled Thorol, eh? Ing made a push to her again, but Thorol raised a hand. It's Bjarki, said Ing, following her gaze. Halvor's chief pathfinder was bounding over the beach toward them, his sword and shield strapped to his back. What have you found? Thorol called as he loped past. Bjarki slowed, breathing heavily. Kviltilfer, we found her. She's up ahead. See, I told you, said Thorol, turning to the other shield maiden. Frithjof is too much of a coward to lose his ship. He will be sitting fat on Halvor's loot, like Hreidmar and his dwarves. Ing knitted her brow, and her still tracking the pathfinder as she jogged over the sand. And of the crew, are they all there? Bjarki shrugged as he packed up his pace, heading towards the camp. There is no one. Halvor's company, over 20 warriors all told, stood atop of a dune, stared down at Varulfur's sister ship. Frithjof had moored her on the beach, away from the draw of the tide. Her oars had been stowed away and sails furled, but there was no sign of life anywhere aboard. Bjarki and his trackers stood by Halvor, engaged in widespread conversation, while the rest of the party edged down towards the ship. Do you think an ambush? Ing's question lacked any conviction, but Thorol shook her head anyway. She couldn't see any of the signs of a fight from the dune. No bodies littered the sand, and there wasn't a drop of blood to be found around Kveldfur. They must have moved inland. She waved her shields towards the dense forest beside them, and then squinted into the gloom herself. A coarse thicket covered the land between the beach and the rock face that loomed above. The trees were tightly packed, leaving hardly enough space for a man and his shield to pass through, and malformed roots snaked their way across the forest floor. Fool that he was, it was unlike Frithjof to leave his ship unguarded. And for what? They walked through parts unknown? A shout from aboard the boat saw Thorol's eyes snap back to Kveldfur. Uba and Katya, Two of Halvor's senior blooded warriors had clambered up the rungs of the ship and were waving everyone closer. A pair of them were covering their faces, and Yupa rushed on something watery before climbing back down. I do not like this, said Ing as she grabbed Thorol by the shoulder. The two navigated the steep incline together, slipping and sliding as they made their way onto even ground. They were among the first to reach the bottom of the rise, and they pushed their way towards Halvor and his trackers, who had moved down ahead. Ulfgar gave them a curt nod and shifted up to let them through. He was normally the first to crack a smile, but his face was grim. Might have been better we remained away from this bay. He gritted his teeth and turned to look at the sea. Beyond the shelter of the cove, the storm still raged, and the wind still howled. But beneath the crags of this new island, everything was peaceful. I reminded the tales of Nestrond in this place, of the cursed and the damned. That hall is woven of serpent spines. Their Nilhogr sucked corpses of the dead, and the wolf tore men on dead body shore. Thurl quivered. You're always one to set the mood. It is not me. The old warrior thumbed his hand and then rolled his neck before meeting her eyes. Old Ove has felt it too. We were not meant to come here. Ingafod. I always feel something, but sometimes it's just a madness inside his own head. Mock him if you like, that he has seen more than you can know, more than you can understand. Ing shrugged at that, and they walked in silence for a moment, behind Halvor and the Pathfinders. Ulfgar took such things seriously, more so than most. To argue with him was like pushing a bull through mud with his horns pointed at you. He bore his faith on his skin, and his shaven scalp was adorned with symbols of protection. Othala runes, the Fae, and tributes to Heimdall himself. Ing was about to snap back with a delayed retort when she gagged. That smell. Thorol made a face, covered her nose with her forearm, like rotten fish. Her eyes stared to water at the stench that salted her senses, but she walked forward gamely, even as others choked and swore behind her. The rest of the party gathered at the base of the longship and waited as Bjarki and Ulfgar clambered up the rungs and stared over the side. They've left their shields. Thorol glanced up at the rack, which remained untouched. That's Akis, said Ing, pointing her sword towards a red and white shield above them. They must have needed to move quickly. Thorol nodded, but she felt the first hint of uneasiness grip her as she watched Bjarki and Ulfgar turn to face the gathered party. It is a serpent's brood, Bjarki stated solemnly. He made the sign of the Fae and spat at the boat. This is Jormunder's lot, and we are not welcome in this place. Ulfgar dropped down to the sand, and then helped the older warrior down. It is an ill omen, he said, once Bjarki was on the beach beside him. A crowd of confused faces stared back at him until Halvor strode forward and nimbly clambered at the side of the boat. Eels, he said simply as he stared down at the hole. The storm must have seen them dumped in Fritoff's boat, nothing more. Ulfgar mumbled something from below, but Halvor silenced him with a wave of his hand. There's nothing of the Midgard serpent here. Do you think we would have found this ship if the world snake had come upon it? Ulfgar shrugged and thumbed his palm nervously. I simply say what I see. The Jarl took his head and stared at the party for a moment, sweeping his gaze across the dunes. Frithjof is a fool, he said. We all know this. Some of the men chuckled at his words, but most were quiet. Ulfgar had put them on edge. He has left his ship unguarded and changed off to see what treasures he can find for himself. He means to leave us with this ship like a nursemaid. Halvor jumped down from the boat and dusted his hands off. We were not his mercenaries, are we? Thurl found herself muttering her dissatisfaction with the idea along with the rest of the party. We will move inland and find the fool. Then we can make a bed from the eels he has left in his boat. A grin split Halvor's face as the mood lifted, and raucous laughter was joined by his warriors. Come now, said Halvor once the laughter had receded. Frithjof can't have made it that far. He nodded to his pathfinders. He moved up quickly into the forest. There is still a little light before nightfall. As the company moved forward towards the tree line, Ing pushed past Thorol and headed towards the boat. What are you doing? Thorol sighed and followed after her friend. You heard Halvor? We don't have much light left. I want to see. Ing dropped her gear into the sand and turned to Thorol. Are you not curious to see what Hormangander has left for us? She didn't wait for the answer before pulling herself off the side of the boat. Thorol sighed again and dropped her own gear to climb into Kveltover. The wood had started to rot, and the smell of decaying flesh intensified as she pulled herself up. Ing exhaled as she reached the top and stared down into the hold. Gods, Bjarki was right. What is it, Ing? Will asked, hearing her tone. She didn't wait for a reply before peering down herself. The entire floor of the Kveltover was covered in writhing, seething mass of serpentine bodies. Their silver forms shifted in the half-light, wrapping themselves around one another in a slippery embrace. Thorol nearly gagged at the sight of them, turned away as the smell threatened to overpower her. There are so many! Ing curled her lips in disgust and watched as the creatures rolled across the floor of the boat. Frithjof and his company will have much to clean once this lot runs its sun. They will have no help from me, said Thorol. She took one last look at the flowing mass of bodies and then clambered back down to the rungs. Coming, or we will be left behind. The living and the dead. Of Halvor's company, 4 were left to guard over Valrulfur, and another 2 to wait by Frithjof's ship in case of his return. The rest set out to the dark forest with torches lit against the coming of night. I had not seen nor heard any sign of beast or bird in this place. Ulfgar swatted away a gnat with his torch. Only these bastards. Your blood is too pure, said Ing, but I have the cure. She swigged from her flask and handed it to Thorol. We will not eat you if your blood is poison. Thorol shrugged and took a sip, almost spluttering as the bitter liquid went down her throat. What is this? She asked, wiping her mouth with a hand, and looked at the flask skeptically. Bot gave it to me as a gift before we left. It was all we had from his journey east. No wonder his mind is so addled. Thorol sniffed at the container and made a face. I would rather be eaten, I think. Suit yourself, said Ing, taking back the spirits. But don't cry to me when your skin is raw from scratching. Ulfgar snorted. Ing the generous. It is Ing the bloodied, now that I have fought the Christians and stolen their silver. She adjusted the shield on her arm and stared up into the canopy. They had walked for many miles beneath the outstretched limbs of ancient trees, and there had been no sign of Frithjof or his company. Not long after leaving the shore, Bjarki had found a single path that cut its way through the forest. It was the only way past the near impenetrable undergrowth, and Halvor led them on it towards the great crags they'd seen from the boats. There are no stars. Ing frowned up at the branches and then shook her head. They hide from this place. They're hidden behind clouds, said Thorol. She felt uneasy since finding Kveldover in a slippery cargo. I didn't need Ing's superstitious compounding that. There was a storm, remember? Or is it that this place is outside of our own? Ulfgar glanced around him, holding his torch close to the trees. Their boughs and roots were scarred with age, and the leaves seemed to shrink away so close to the open flame. Beneath the roots of the world tree, there exists a place of terrible suffering. It is Hell's kingdom. Thorol rolled her eyes. But we have not died, Ulfgar. All this getting into your head with his stories, unless you think we sunk to the bottom of the sea in that storm. The warrior shrugged. Who's to say what we didn't? Our flesh? Thorol pulled down her sleeve and pointed at her bare skin. Our sweat and thirst? You think the dead suffer these things? Ulfgar flinched at the tone of her voice and raised a hand in supplication. It is only a thought. I do not mean to anger you, Storm Maiden. It is not you, Ulfgar. Thorol took a deep breath and rolled her knuckles against her shield. I am sorry. It is this place, the quietness of getting to me. It gets under my skin too, said Ulfgar. When these bastards aren't busy eating me. He swung his torch at a cloud of insects, and then beckoned to the other shield maiden. I'll try some of your poison now, think. Ing grinned and handed him the flask. It gets better after the first sip, promise. Ulfgar raised a skeptical brow and took a hesitant sip. His face paled and his brow creased as liquor passed his lips. This is what Bot calls a drink? He spat on the forest floor and groaned. No wonder he always stinks of cat piss. Ing grinned and took back the flask. It has kept me warm through many a cold night, and it's better than being eaten alive. That it is, said Ulfgar, pressing on ahead. He waved an arm towards the thinning trees as a pale moon emerged from behind the diminishing canopy. It looks like this dark forest has finally come to an end. Now we will see what wolfish murderers and serpent spines haunt this island. The forest opened up to a wide valley nestled between steep, windswept hills. A thin strip of silver hinted at the existence of a river not far ahead. A snaking path ran the length of the valley and then disappeared beyond the gray walls of the mountain range in the distance. Halvor ordered the company forward, beyond the shelter of the forest, towards the river. The warriors were relieved to find themselves with empty skies above their heads once more, and moved with purpose. They moved out from undergrowth. Thorol couldn't help but notice the lack of stars. Even without the cover of clouds, the sky was like a black sheet, with only the wan light of the moon guiding their way. We will camp by the river, Halvor led the company himself, setting a grueling pace as we saw them all wet with sweat and breathing heavily. He waved his axe at the chief scout and motioned to the gray peaks. Bjarkr and Sigurd will move to the mountains while we rest. He turned to his warriors, walking backward as he took them all in. Do not sit too heavily on your meat this night. I think we will all need to be sharp come morning. His warriors grumbled to themselves, but accepted his warning without rebuke. Most were too tired for thoughts of drink, and the idea of a proper night's sleep was enough to keep them motivated. Ing had got off to see if she could not join Bjarki and his scouts, and Thorol found herself walking between Ove and Ulfgar. The moon had not yet reached its zenith, and its pale light made everything look like a shade of gray. There is no sign of that fool or his company, said Ulfgar. No tracks, no fires, nothing of our friends. Halvor leads us on a merry chase. He spat at the ground and shook his head. This place is empty. Ove snorted from beneath his hood. It's not empty, Ulfgar. You are just blind to what occupies this land. He waved a hand at the mountains before them and smiled. We will walk where few have walked before, in the place between the living and the dead. It was Thorol's turn to snort now. Old Ove, you have seen so much, and yet your stories are always the same. The living and the dead, the beast of Nestron, the serpent that eats the world. Why have we seen none of these things? Every year you cry your tale, and every year we ship back home, alive and richer than before. I only repeat what I have seen, girl. Ove made the sign of the Fae with a gnarled hand and turned to look at her. His skin was weathered by years of salt and sun, but his blue eyes were as piercing as ever. He stared at her for a moment and then smiled. You have seen something too, I think. Thor shrugged. In her mind's eye, she recalled that flicker of silver beneath the waves, that formless shape slipping through the sea. It is no blessing to have hold of the sight, Elf continued. To see one's future played out before one's very eyes has damned many a man to insanity. But you must be better than that. What is it that you saw? Asked Hofgar. It was nothing. She shook her head, readjusting her shield on her arm. Ova's mad. You know that as well as I. I have seen it too, girl, Ove barked. It is the world's end that slithers behind your eyes. He rushed out a hacking cough and laughed. Do not be afraid. They will all see. Thurl snarled at the old warrior and picked up her pace, leaving the pair of them behind. It was only when she was at the head of the company and Ove's choking laughter had faded away that she felt her mind settle. He is mad, she thought to herself. Him and Bjarki both. Still, there was something in the way he had looked at her that made her think otherwise. The old man had seen more years than any of them. His words, though often veiled by myth, were rarely false. She sighed to herself and tightened her grip on her shield. Either way, she would meet her fate head on. The first night on the island was cold, and Halvor ordered massive fires to fend off the chill. He cared not that someone might see them. After all, who would dare attack Halvor and his company of bloodied? The warriors drew lots for sentry duty, and those that could tried to slip in a few hours' sleep before dawn. Thorol and the other shield maiden had laid their kit out beside one of the bonfires and sipped from Ing's bitter liquor while Ove told stories of the night and of the first fires. When Loki, Odin, and Heidnir crossed the vast mountains, they came across a herd of oxen. The old warrior took a bite from his dried meat and crinkled his nose. Fresh meat, not like we've been nibbling on, eh, Ulfgard? Ulfgard blinked into wakefulness at the sound of the same and stared across the fire at the old warrior. What now? He said. Come on. Ing rolled across the grass and extended her flask towards him. Don't be boring, Ulfgar. Sit with us. He shook his shaven head and pulled his blankets tighter to his chest. I have the next watch. It would look poor for me if Halvor caught me drunk. You heard what he said. She stuck out her tongue and took a steady draught from the bottle. You will be sad when there is none left. He shrugged and closed his eyes. As long as I get my sleep, I do not care. What about you, Ove? Ing turned to the veteran. Something to fend off the cold and make your heart kick like a newborn's? I already see things that are not there, said Ove, chewing on his meat. I'd rather not tempt fate with your firewater. More for me and Thurl, then, she said as the others laughed. She took another sip from her flask and squinted into the darkness surrounding the camp. The mountains were mere silhouettes in the distance, looming over the sides of the valley like a bastion of some great castle. The river they'd seen from afar was, in fact, two concurrent streams racing beside one another towards the sea. They bathed in its water and even fished. There was no life to be found in it, and the warriors had made do with dried meats once more. For a moment, she thought she spotted a movement on the ridge above their camp, a single figure stepping into the moonlight. She squinted up at the hill, trying to bring it into focus, but whatever she'd seen had gone. You all right, girl? Ove cocked his head, a strange look on his face. It's nothing, said Ian, shaking her head, and then bringing her eyes back down to the fire. It is only shadows. It is nothing, or is it shadows? showed his teeth before winking at Ing. They're not the same. The shieldman rolled her eyes and leaned back on her bedroll. She was tired of Ove and his riddles. It was both and neither, she said, turning her back to him and the fire. He could figure that one out for himself. She closed her eyes and let the warmth from the fire and the soft hum of her friend's chatter lull her to sleep. In the morning, Ulfgar was gone. Bjarki shook his head as he walked over to Thorol and the others. There was no sign of him. Sigurd saw him down the watch, but after that, he did not return. Where did he stand sentry? Thorol had been first awake, and to find his bedroll empty. Not far from here, Bjarki said. He pointed to the base of the ridge, on the other side of the river. He took over from Ava and left camp well after midnight. His watch was to end a few hours before dawn, but no one had seen him. He can't have gotten far, said Ing, staring at the ridge. Why would he have left us in the first place? Thorol licked her lips and followed Ing's gaze. The drink had given her a splitting headache, and she was finding it hard to concentrate. It makes no sense, she concluded. I am inclined to agree, came a deep voice from behind her. Halvor stood next to Bjarki and nodded to them each in turn. His mane of hair was wet from the river, and his beard had grown out. Flecks of white and gray dotted the scruff, making him appear even more distinguished. It is not like Ulfgar to disappear like this. Thin lines creased his forehead as he frowned. I suspect he has been taken by whoever has been tracking us this last day. Thorol and Ing's immediate questions were ignored, and Halvor silenced them with a wave of his hand. Bjarki spotted them when he landed. A small band, maybe 3 or 4 in total. They had been shadowing us since we moved inland, but I had not expected them to act so boldly. Not against our numbers. Ing shivered. Silhouette he'd seen to the ridge. Who are they? I cannot be sure. Locals, perhaps. Or other folk like us who've been washed up by the storm. The Pathfinders have been instructed to catch one of them, if possible. Then we will see. And what of Ulfgar? Thorol's eyes narrowed as she watched her Jarl. She already suspected the answer. There's nothing we can do. We don't know the land, and Bjarki says the surrounds turned into more gullies and ravines than he can count. Too many places to disappear. We will find what has happened to him when we catch one of his captors. Thorol nodded. She knew Halvor did not allow for dissent. What was done, and she just has to hope Bjarki and his trackers were as good as they thought they were. None of this for the others. Halvor met her eyes and stared down. I do not have fears of shadowmen spread through the company. There we will learn of this when the time is right. We will keep your secret ours. Smiled. Nothing to catch these specters or to harm them. They cannot be hurt. They will walk between the worlds. This I know. Ulfgar knows it too. We will see, old man, said Halvor, returning to leave. There is little that walks in this world that does not fear the sharp end of my axe. They walked for half a day before someone spotted smoke rising behind them, and Halvor called them to a halt. He signaled to Sigurd and those scouts not out searching for Ulfgar and his mysterious captors. They quickly moved up the bridge to get an eye on where the smoke was coming from. Could be Fritjof and his lot. Sitting, she stopped the kid on the ground and placed a foot on one of the larger rocks around them. The valley started to narrow as they closed in one of the crags. The rocky leaded the floor around them. Could be, could be. Oak sucked on his teeth and tracked the scouts up the hill. Could be a funeral pyre. Best not to wonder on such things until we can be sure. Thora shielded her eyes from the sun with a hand and stared at the rising plumes of black smoke. There is another, she said, pointing a little ways away from the first cloud. It is smaller, but it is the same. Ian clambered atop the rock and leaned against Thorol as she said, she tried to get a better look. She's right. There's more smoke from somewhere further back. We will find out just now, said Ove, gesturing to the ridge. Halvor's scouts were racing down the incline, trying their best to remain sure-footed as they hurtled down towards them. It's the boats! The cry went up like wildfire. Thorol felt a familiar feeling of uncertainty crowd around her own thoughts. We're trapped here, she thought as she joined the milling mass of Norsemen crowding around Halvor. It is true, said the Jarl plainly. Our ships have been set afire, both Verulfer and Frithjof ships, though it does not look like the fire on Kveldfer has taken so well. She still may be salvageable. What are we to do? A voice called from the masked warriors. Thorol could see the company was close to panic. Tired men and women stranded far from home on an island they'd never seen before. It would not take much to push them over the edge. To his credit, Halvor did not seem perturbed by the situation. He rolled his shoulders and turned to Sigurd. The two engaged in quiet conversation, both of them glancing up the clouds of smoke in the distance, before Halvor raised a hand to silence the company. We have no choice but return to ships and see what we can salvage from the fires. He nodded to Sigurd, who moved to gather the remaining pathfinders. We will wait for Bjarki's return, and then we shall make with haste for the coast. And of Frithjof, it was Ing's voice that Thorol heard. She turned to see the other shield maidens standing beside two of Halvor's largest warriors, Theodoric and Henrik. What happened to Frithjof and his company? And what of Alfgar? Are we to leave them here to this island and its people? Halfgar gave her a look of warning and then rolled the handle of his axe with his wrists. There is nothing that can be done. We must look to our own preservation now. His words were met with agreement by the guide of the company, but Ing was not yet done. If it were you, we would stay until we found you, or we were all dead. Halvor smiled, revealing a row of straight white teeth. But it is not me, Shield Maiden, and I say we go. Before Ing could continue her protest, Halvor whistled and waved at the remaining pathfinders. You have until nightfall, and then we are gone. Ing gritted her teeth, but looked up at Thorol's approach. Just like that. Maybe Bjarki will find something, perhaps of Ulfgar or Frithjof or both. Ing shook her head and wiped at her eyes. She was tired, and she was hungover, and she wanted to see her friends again. It might already be too late. There is something wrong about this place. There is no life here, not even a bird. Just these pests that want to drain us of our blood. She swiped at the air, as if to make her point. Halvor must know it. If we leave now, we will seal their fates. Thorol nodded. There was nothing more she could say. Halvor had spoken, and his word was law. Night had long since fallen when the first of Bjarki's scouts returned. Tired-eyed and weary-limbed, they slowly streamed in. They spoke of a great ravine, guarded by the walls of ancient pillars, of figures cut from stone, and strange sounds in the trees. They spoke of an uneasiness that settled upon them, and a feeling of being watched, of being stalked, hunted. But of Fritjof and Ulfgar, there was no sign. We wait on Bjarki, Halvor told the company. When he returned, we will make for the coast, for our ships. They waited until the night grew cold, when even fire barely kept the chill from their bones. The camp sat in a state of frozen anticipation, with each warrior ready to move at a moment's notice. But that notice never came. Halvor grew restless and took up pacing around the perimeter, harassing his sentries and forcing them to make deeper forays into the night to search for the Pathfinder. It wasn't long before Thurl and Ing were sent out with a party into the black of night with only their torches to guide them. We will find nothing like this, said Ing, stomping around in the night like fools, hoping to fall upon Bjark by luck. Thurl lifted the torch above her head and watched the flickering shadows around them. Then they had been walking for hours now, with still no sign of the Pathfinder. What hope she had of finding him was diminished, and she just wanted to return to the camp and to the warmth of the fires. She sighed as she stared at the hills that loomed above them. The peaks were hidden by the night, and what little light the moon shone down on them failed to illuminate the darkest corners of the valley. What else would you have us do? Thor lowered a torch. You heard Halvor. We must look to ourselves now. If we don't find Bjarki, we have to leave without him. Ing shook her head. Halvor will not leave this. Halvor will not leave his precious Pathfinder behind. Then we must do as he says, and search every crevice of this valley before dawn. We must do as he says, and search every crevice of this valley before dawn. The other shield maiden rubbed a hand over her scalp. She had not shaved it in weeks. Her stubble now covered the tattoos that spiraled across her head. Ove was taking it well, she said. Ulfgar was like a son to him. Thorl took a swig from her flask and wiped her mouth. He said he knew what was coming, him and Ulfgar both. How could they know? You know what they are like. Thorl turned to her friend and waved at the sky. The gods tell them stories or plant ideas in their heads. At least that is what Ove wants us to think. It is either true or he is mad. Sometimes I think it is both. They walked in silence for a moment, keeping within hailing distance of the rest of the party. Arvid and Dagfinn were barely a dozen yards from them, while Oscar and Tommen ranged ahead, the torches appearing like stars in the distance. And of course, there were no stars here. Thorl hadn't seen one since they'd arrived. She looked at the sky, careful to keep her footing on the uneven rocks that surrounded the gully. It is like Ove says. Ian came to a standstill behind her. The silence of another place. They were still standing together, staring at the emptiness above them. And Uskar's horn rang out in the darkness. It blew once, then twice. Then there was silence. He's found something, Thorl, as she skipped down from the rocks. More torches were moving through the valley now, heading toward Uskar's horn had sounded from. If it's Ulfgar, I'll box his nose in for leading us on this merry chase. Ink's face shone with hope, and she jogged ahead of Thorl towards the gathering torches. Then we will see if Ove saw that coming too, she called over her shoulder. Thorl smiled at the thought and picked up her pace. Part 1 over.